James Lees-Milne lived a long and very interesting life. He was born in 1908 and he died in 1997. So he lived through both world wars, the rise of Nazism, the rise of communism, and the dramatic post-1945 changes. But he's remembered, if at all, for his intimate involvement in the prosaic world of the English country house. He recorded his early life up to 1942 in this autobiography, Another Self, published in 1970, so a long time afterwards, and thereafter in two series of diaries, the first covering his life from 1942 to 1949, and the second after a long gap from 1971 to 1997. Those diaries were published periodically up to towards the end of his life. From the 1936 to 1950, less 2 years war service, he was employed as the secretary to the National Trust Country Houses Committee, and then part-time until the early 1960s. His modest title and equally modest salary belie the huge influence that he had. He used a combination of charm, tact, and persistence to persuade landowners up and down the length of England to transfer their houses to the National Trust, principally to avoid the great cost of upkeep and also the penal death duties which otherwise they would have had to pay. And it's been estimated that he was personally responsible for bringing to the National Trust 50 houses which otherwise might not exist today. And those included some of the great houses of England, Charlecote, Knowle, Petworth, and Stourhead. And it was Max Hastings, the historian, who in 2007 described him as the man who saved England. Of course, it was a particular limited part of England that he saved, but nevertheless a very important one. This talk covers his work for the National Trust up to the end of the Second World War and slightly beyond, 1949 or thereabouts, and some of the houses that he brought to the National Trust, particularly those near to Broadway. But I should emphasize that this is a talk really based upon James's own words and recollections. His own words and recollections were not always completely accurate, and may not always have been completely truthful. There are one or two caveats I'll mention as we go along, but on the whole, it's simply him and his own words, ladies and gentlemen. So the Lees-Milnes were country squires going back several centuries. Their wealth came in latter times principally from a Lancashire cotton mill, which James's grandfather floated on the London Stock Exchange in 1898 for the grand sum of £280,000. His father, Major George, you can see there on the left-hand side, served in the Cheshire Yeomanry, though not for very long. Long enough to acquire a very grand uniform, but not for many years. And the reason he ceased to be a member of the Cheshire Yeomanry was that he came into his inheritance in around about 1904. And when he did, he devoted the remainder of his life to the enthusiastic pursuit of good living, hunting, gambling, and, dare I say it, philandering. The only work that he did was to attend monthly board meetings in Oldham. Goodness only knows what he made of Oldham in the early part of the 20th century. He lost his right eye in a hunting accident and wore an eye patch, which we'll see in a moment, and cut a rather rakish figure. His wife, Helen, who you can see in that rather faded photograph on the right-hand side. He married in 1904. They had 3 children, of whom James was the middle. There was an older sister and a younger brother, of whom James makes virtually no mention at all in anything that he seems to have written. There was also the small matter of the illegitimate child, a son by the coachman's daughter, born in 1907, who, unfortunate boy, was packed off to Australia almost the moment he left the womb, and didn't realize what his true parentage was until he was an adult. There's George in the get-up of the Evesham Home Guard in 1940, a painting with his eye patch cutting that rakish figure. So far as Wickhamford Manor is concerned, George came across the manor a couple of miles from Broadway by chance in 1906. It was for sale, and he produced his checkbook on the spot and bought it for £2,300. £2,300 bought not only the manor, but the church that stood in its grounds. I'm sure some of you have seen the church and perhaps visited the church. I can see some nods. So just a few steps away from the house, numerous cottages and 600 acres of prime Vale of Evesham land. Not a bad package. The manor itself dates back to the 13th century. It had been a monastic dependency with a lake in which the monks kept carp. Allegedly their ancestors, or rather their descendants, were still living in the pond when the Lees-Milnes took over. And much later, when James wrote one of the many shell guides to England, which he was responsible for, he described the church as one of the finest in Worcestershire, with its 3-deck pulpit, Georgian box pews, and famous Sands memorials. There is the church, and you can see the Sands memorials on the bottom left, alabaster, and the Georgian box pews. It's a very charming little church. So far as the Sands family is concerned, you probably know this, but just in case there's anybody who's not heard the story, the Sands family, who were closely associated with Wickhamford, and there's a road as you drive from Evesham to Broadway on the left-hand side, which is Sands Avenue or Sands Lane or something like that. You'll probably notice it. The Sands family was related by marriage to the Washington family. Its most famous member being George Washington, who was to become the first president of the United States. And on the floor of the church is this tombstone dedicated in Latin to Penelope Washington, herself a distant relative of George. And the tombstone bears the Washington family arms, and I've blown that up on the right-hand side, a family arms of 3 stars and 2 red stripes, allegedly the prototype of the Stars and Stripes flag of the United States. How much truth there is in that is difficult to say. The story apparently gained currency towards the end of the 19th century, which has led to a steady stream of Americans coming to the obscure village of Wickhamford to have a look at the floor, and still they come today. Life for George and Helen revolved around the North Cotswold hunt. George played polo, and in June and July of each year they gave tennis parties. There were many expensive cars, and find my pointer. So this is Haynes here. Haynes, the chauffeur, Norris Haynes, was the chauffeur employed by them from 1906 until Helen died in 1962. So 56 years of unbroken service to the family. The Lees-Milnes were gamblers, and their main companions in their gambling were Jack and Heather Muir from Kifsgate. The two couples would go every year to Monte Carlo to play the tables. George also gambled large sums at horse racing, and much to the disgust of his son James, occasionally on dog racing as well. Apparently there was dog racing in Gloucester in those days, and that's where George used to go. And occasionally when he had a decent win, he would contribute a large sum of money to some restoration of the church, much to the discomfiture of the vicar. Church-going meant a short stroll from the house to the church, where they occupied the family manor pew. And the family didn't mix with the grand families. They were rather lower down the social scale, but they mixed with people like the Ayres-Monsells at Dumbleton Hall and the Holland Martins at Overbury Court near Tewkesbury. And in all this, there was little space for the three kiddies. They were looked after by a series of nannies and a nursery maid for whom James developed and maintained a lifelong affection. As to the parents, they squabbled incessantly. James adored his mother, but was in awe of his father. "I longed to be admired by him," he wrote. And it was only when George was terminally ill in the early 1950s with bladder cancer that father and son really connected for the first time, and James developed a real love for his father and realized at much the same time that perhaps his devotion to his mother, who had been rather feckless, had been misplaced. Just as we're looking at this smashing little car here is called a Stellite. We'll see it again. I'm not much into classic cars, but if I had a classic car, I wouldn't mind a little Stellite. It's absolutely smashing. And that's Helen sitting in it. So James, with his elder sister there, where are we? There's the sister, there's the brother. In the manor garden in about 1912. And the three siblings mixed with the village children and with the Ashwin children at nearby Bretforton Manor. And at the beginning of his autobiography, James recalled that as a child, he lived in a fantasy world of his imagination and shut out what was to him the unreal world of everyday life. His stable and contained family life survived the outbreak of the Great War. Indeed, the family were only aware of it when George opened the Daily Telegraph at breakfast one day and exclaimed, "Good God, we've declared war on Germany." In June 1917, this all came to an end, however. He was sent away to prep school at Lockers Park, where he shared a room with two boys who would become lifelong friends until the premature deaths of both. One was Tom Mitford, one of the famous Mitford family, and the other was Basil Ava, later the fourth Marquess of Dufferin. And through Tom, James met the Mitford sisters and formed an unrequited love for Diana. In 1921, all three boys went to Eton. As you can see, James was a very pretty boy. I'm not going to say much about his sexual life, but just occasionally. A very pretty boy, and he was seduced, aged 15, by a gentleman who was later to become Lieutenant Colonel Barclay Villiers. And of the experience, James wrote, "Thrilling, alarming, and wicked-seeming, and delicious it was." And so James embarked on the gay and bisexual life, which he was to pursue throughout his life, beyond his eventual marriage to a woman who was herself bisexual. Here we've got the Mitfords. So there's James there, looking, I think, a little gauche. Is that unfair? I don't know. This is Diana, and that's Tom. He was a very intimate friend of that family. After school, Oxford, in the autumn of 1928, James went to Oxford, where he had a brief romantic attachment with fledgling actor John Gielgud, who was 4 years his senior. And of John Gielgud, James wrote, "For 6 weeks I was infatuated with him, and then it passed like a cloud." At Oxford, James became obsessed with architecture. He visited Seasingcote, which we all know, don't we, just over the hill. And Seasingcote was also adored by his friend John Betjeman, who immortalised it in verse. And he and Betjeman were given to various japes. These included visiting the Oxford museums at quiet times, opening the cabinets, which in those days were kept unlocked, and inserting bits of rock and pottery recently picked up in various places, attaching Latin labels to them and passing them off as items of great archaeological significance. And I like to think that some might still be there, who knows? Who recognises this house? Rousham House and Gardens, Rousham, which I interject and say I think is my favourite house, certainly my favourite garden, located between Banbury and Oxford. If you haven't been there, then it's a good place to go, particularly as there's a nice sign at the entrance saying, "No children under 15. Dogs welcome." So you can take your pet, but you can't take your grandchild or your child. And the house is partly designed by William Kent, but the gardens are really one of the few surviving William Kent gardens, completely untouched. The house has been in the hands of the Cotswold Dormers for centuries. They employed Kent to do the garden, and it's been untouched ever since. Anyway, that's a diversion from what I ought to be saying, which is that really it was a visit to Rousham, which James claims was the light bulb moment for him. I say allegedly because he refers to the incident in his autobiography, which is replete with fabulous stories. Some, as I said, may not having much association with the truth. But as he tells it, the house had been leased by the Cotswold Dormers one summer to somebody called Maurice Hastings. Maurice invited various students, including James, to come for the weekend for a party. Hastings got thoroughly drunk and shot a shotgun at the private parts of the statues on the terrace and attacked the family portraits with a hunting crop. James says that he felt numb with dismay and, quote, "I made a vow that I would devote my energies and abilities to preserving the country houses of England." Well, as I say, that he developed and pursued that ambition is not in doubt. That it arose at the single moment he describes is. One person who was undoubtedly present claims that James was nowhere near the house that weekend, but no matter. And so the Country Houses Committee, after Oxford, James's working life rather meandered until March of 1936, when he was appointed the secretary to the Country Houses Committee at a salary of £300. And he wrote that no job could have held greater appeal to him. Just a word about the National Trust at this time. Up to this point in time, the National Trust had not acquired houses. The National Trust had acquired land, and that was all it was really interested in. But by the 1930s, the country house style of living was increasingly difficult to sustain. Agricultural depression, wage inflation, taxes with a marginal rate under a Labour government of 95%, and especially death duties. And not only that, that the Great War of 1914-1918 had stripped country houses of a generation of owners and successors in title, the sons and the grandsons who might have taken over, and a generation of people who would otherwise have worked the land and worked in the house. And so that, together with the crash of 1929, made things very, very difficult. And so it was that in May of 1935, Lord Zetland approached the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who was then Neville Chamberlain, with a proposal. And the idea was this: the owner would donate a house for preservation and provide a substantial endowment for its maintenance thereafter. In return, the owner and his successors could live in the house in perpetuity and be absolved from death duties. Now, pursuant to that scheme, 225 owners were approached, 42 agreed to an interview, and by mid-1937, the scheme was up and running. But prior to World War II, only Wickhamford Manor near Wolverhampton. Have you been to Wickhamford Manor? I'm sure many of you have. Again, a good place to visit, particularly if you're interested in the pre-Raphaelites. Only Wickhamford Manor near Wolverhampton had been transferred. But it was to this scheme that James was going to devote the next 25 years of his life. Just a few incidents in his early life before we get to look at some of the actual houses. He describes some incidents from his childhood in Another Self. This is Overbury Court, near Tewkesbury. It's a house that was a family seat of the Holland Martins. Martin having been originally the founder of Martin's Bank, which I think I can just about remember, Martin's Bank. Mrs. Eleanor Holland Martin was a formidable woman who regularly umpired tennis tournaments when James was a child. Of her, he said, "Woe betide whoever partnered a son of hers and let him down in a boys' doubles, which I invariably did." Mrs. Holland Martin would boom out, "Pull up your socks, young Lees-Milne." Oh, the agony and dread. Many years later, on the 26th of May 1944, James went to Overbury Court for lunch. Mrs. Holland Martin had become very old, small, bent, and absolutely docile and friendly. She lived on until 1955, dying at the age of 86. And the house is still in the ownership of the same family, although the male line has now died out, and the present incumbent has taken the surname of her husband. And there's been mention of the Gordon Russell Design Museum. We had our summer party there last year. I can see one or two nods there. And I took these photographs to show that the house looks much as it did in that photograph I showed you previously, but also to show you the back of the house, which I suppose would have been called the bowling green when the house was built. And that's where the tennis tournaments used to take place. So I can just imagine Mrs. Holland Martin sitting on a chair somewhere along here, yelling at James Lees-Milne as he failed to return a serve again. Now, I said we'd come back to the stellite, didn't I? And there it is. And this time we've got it in a very fetching yellow colour. And here you can see an advertisement for it. The Wolseley-designed engine, 4-cylinder, monoblock, water-cooled, thermosiphon, ignition, Bosch, high-tension magneto, 150 guineas, and it's yours. This was Helen's motor car. Not only was Dad fairly feckless in terms of being a loyal husband, Helen wasn't far behind. She had a perennial extramarital lover called Jock Campbell, and indeed she spent Armistice Day in 1918 in his company, after which he emigrated to Canada, in fact to Newfoundland, and she used to pop over there from time to time to be with him. However, Helen was not altogether faithful in her unfaithfulness. One summer's evening after James had left Eton, so perhaps in about 1926, she announced to him during a stroll in the gardens her intention to go ballooning the next day. "I've met," she said, "the most enchanting person with a balloon." She promised to let James see her off, provided he said nothing to his father, because father would be anxious. What he would be anxious about, Helen did not explain. So the following morning, they set off for Broadway in Helen's little Stellite, and Dad saying, "Back for luncheon?" And Helen saying, "Oh, long before," with her fingers firmly crossed. And as they passed through Broadway and up Fish Hill, James noticed how radiantly guiltless and expectant his mother looked. She'd no luggage, save for her handbag and a heavy object wrapped in tissue paper. She stopped at the Fish Inn at the top of the hill, there it is, and inquired of a gentleman outside the pub whether he'd seen a balloon. "No, you haven't seen a balloon," he said, "but I have seen a lorry with a pile of dirty washing on the back." Helen drew the obvious conclusion. She motored between the two pillars leading to Broadway Tower, and soon they heard the hissing of gas and saw the dirty washing. "Here I am, Jack," she said, calling out to what James described as an odious little man with a Charlie Chaplin moustache. He was with a young lad who hoisted Helen onto his shoulders and pitched her into the basket. And with that, the basket rose into the air. The tissue paper was removed from the object to reveal an old First World War helmet, which Helen's brother had worn in the trenches, which she put on her head. Up they went, and as they did so, Helen blew kisses with one hand and dispensed pound notes with the other. James and the young lad collected up the money and made their way back to the Fish Inn, where a few jars were consumed. He doesn't say, but I mean, he must have driven the Stellite back, assuming there's a word of truth in any of this. So he went back home and was rather upset to find that it was his father blaming him for his mother's elopement, furious, and said that he was to blame for it. But James, with money in his pocket, telephoned Tom Mitford and asked if he could come to stay. Tom agreed, and so James packed a suitcase, tied it to the handlebars of the family motorbike, and off he went. Now, of course, no talk to the Broadway History Society, no talk, would be complete without, and there he is, without mention of Court Farm and Madame de Navarro. So why on this occasion? Well, in March of 1934, James converted to Catholicism. Dare I say it, I think it had less to do with the teachings of the church and rather more to do with his love of costume, ceremony, and theatricality. He saw the church as a bulwark against communism. His father was horrified, was in deep shock, and said to Helen that they should expect their son to sit during the national anthem with his hat on. And for a year, James was banned from Wickhamford Manor, and this is where Court Farm and Madame de Navarro come in. Instead, he would spend his weekends at Court Farm on the High Street in Broadway, where his mother would secretly come and meet him. His father got to hear of this and considered it an act of great treachery on the part of Helen. His 40-year devotion to Catholicism ended in disillusion in 1974 when he rejected the faith. Well, were you expecting to see a picture of Noel Coward? Possibly not. On the 24th of November 1944, James recorded the passing of Mrs. Astley Cooper of Hambleton Hall in Rutland. She'd been very good to him, and he was in disgrace with his family for having converted. She was, he said, a remarkable old woman with a first-class brain who discovered Noel Coward when he was a boy and was an intimate friend of Malcolm Sargent. Her misfortune, James said, was to be a woman with a brain born into English upper-class country circles, where I suppose a brain was a distinct disadvantage. On Tuesday, the 1st of July, 1947, James bumped into Noel Coward at Wyndham's Theatre in London and told him they had two dead friends in common, one of whom was Mrs. Cooper. Noel Coward said they should dine together when he returned from the United States, but James was not impressed. His white teeth flash when he smiles, but his smile is unconvincing. He's a very ugly man with rather bloated, sagging red cheeks and hollow eyes. He has, moreover, a thin, flat behind, which implies shallowness of character. Well, I think his bum is a bit flat, don't you? Whether it implies shallowness of character, I leave it to you to judge. I can't pass without mentioning Gordon Russell, furniture designer of this town, or this village, now perhaps becoming a town. As an introduction to James's involvement with some of the historic houses near Broadway, one can reflect upon his meeting with Gordon Russell in March of 1943. Gordon came to the National Trust offices. He was then involved in the Board of Trade Design panel on the development of utility furniture. And he wanted to make the point that the Trust ought to be more forward-looking and employ avant-garde as well as archaic architects and not conceal modern necessaries such as petrol pumps under oldie-worldy thatched roofs. And James was very conscious of the need, as he saw it, to prevent the National Trust turning its houses into museums. And this has really been a debate around the National Trust for the last century or so, has it not? When G.M. Trevelyan was employed by the Trust to write a book about the National Trust, James begged him to stress the Trust's opposition to museumization of the buildings that they owned. And he followed this with an entry on the 1st of June 1944 in his diary, which summed up what he saw as his contribution to the preservation of English country houses. And here it is. The lengths to which I've gone, the depths which I have plumbed, the concessions which I have once most reluctantly granted to acquire properties for the National Trust will not all be known by that august and ungrateful body. It might be shocked by the extreme zeal of its servant if it did, yet I like to think that the interest of the property or building rather than the trust has been my objective. Does anybody argue with that? I have to guard against the collector's acquisitiveness. It isn't always to the advantage of a property to be swallowed by our capacious, if beneficial, maw. These pious reflections came to me in the bath this morning. Well, one can think of a number of houses up and down the country which escaped the National Trust for one or two reasons, and you may have your own views as to whether that's been a good or a bad thing. We're actually going to talk about a house now. Snowshill Manor is the nearest property to Broadway with which James was involved. It was acquired by the Trust from Charles Wade in 1952, 4 years before his death in 1956. And Charles was motivated by a desire to ensure the preservation of the house and gardens. James makes only one mention of meeting Charles Wade, and that was on the 6th of August 1948. It's a lovely, lovely description. This morning, went to see Mr. Wade at Snowshill to talk about the old carriages he offers the trust. There's an example. The old carriages which he offers the trust. Also persuaded him to leave us his fine collection of clothes, which he'd suggested bequeathing to some museum. He is the weirdest little man, looking far older than when I saw him 10 years ago. Well, he would be, I suppose. His thick, dark hair, parted in the middle, almost reaches his shoulders. He was wearing knickerbockers, a Norfolk jacket, and a winged collar. Well, it must have been almost a uniform, mustn't it? He lives retired from the world, lamenting the old days when grass grew on the road to Snowshill, and there were 3 gates to open between it and Broadway. Sitting in Charlie Wade's bakehouse where he lives and sleeps is like being in an alchemist's cell, except that here all the implements, anvils, cogs, gyroscopes are spotlessly cleaned and brightly burnished. He could turn a good phrase, could James Lees-Milne. Hidcote, slightly farther away, but with an owner also high on the eccentricity scale, Hidcote Manor. James was involved in convoluted negotiations with Laurie Johnson over a period of 6 years from 1943 to 1949. On the 5th of February 1943, he sat next to him at lunch. Johnston had just seen James's father at Hidcote, and he took James aside and asked if the trust would take over Hidcote after the war without an endowment. And this is how James summed up Johnston with his customary forthright lack of tact. He's a dull little man, and just as I remember him from when I was a child, mother-ridden. Mrs. Winthrop, swathed in grey satin from neck to ankle, would never let him out of her sight. On the 6th of July the same year, James and his father went for tea at Hidcote. Laurie Johnson took us round his famous garden. It's interesting he should describe it as famous at that stage, because Hidcote wasn't much known at that time, I've always understood. No reference to the National Trust. And then this description. Garden not only beautiful, but remarkable in that it is full of surprises, led from one scene to another. Long vistas, little enclosures, full of rare plants from India and Asia, about which Johnston and my father impressed me with their profound knowledge. Well, I'll touch on it now. Anybody, well, you wouldn't know. That's my wife in 1970, I think, when we went to Hidcote. That's my son, Matthew, who's just had his 50th birthday. And that's my elder daughter, Gemma, just as much a rascal now as she was then. And that's a photograph that I took of Hidcote in 1970. So 5 years passed until the 26th of June 1948. away at 9:30 to Hidcote, walked around the garden with Lawrence Johnson, who, apart from absent-mindedness and some loss of memory, is otherwise sane and hale. He said he was incensed by a letter he'd received from the Trust. After much discussion and persuasion, he agreed to leave it by will if I would witness his codicil. And then again, this description. The garden is a dream of beauty. The old-fashioned rose garden smelled as fragrant as I've imagined a garden in a French Gothic tapestry might smell. Laurie Johnson was very nice to me. James's efforts came to an end on the 27th of August 1948. Drove without stop to Hidcote, where we found Lawrence Johnson and lawyer and Nancy Lindsay, who was the daughter of a famous garden designer, Nora Lindsay, of the period. Lawrence signed the deed of gift like a lamb. Since he leaves for abroad in a fortnight, the place may said to be saved. This has been a struggle, but it's been accomplished. We were conducted round the garden by the usual route. How often must this old man have done this tour? I think it's a sad occasion for him, giving away his precious treasure of a garden. I have another Hidcote, he murmured, presumably referring to his garden at Monton. Miss Lindsay is like an old witch, very predatory and interfering. She maintains she's been deputed by Lawrence to supervise the gardens in his absence abroad. We were not overcome with gratitude. Anyway, no mention of this condition was made either by Lawrence or his solicitor before the signing of the transfer. Well, there's been much talk of Coughton in the papers and on the telly recently, hasn't there? And who knew that the Throckmortons had an ace up their sleeves and were going to get the house back, presumably after 75 years or thereabouts. 21 generations of the Throckmortons lived at Coughton since 1409, when they acquired the estate by marriage. It was a famously Catholic family, notoriously associated with the Gunpowder Plot. The plot was led by Robert Catesby, son of William Catesby and Anne Throckmorton of Coughton. Well, you can look up all about the Gunpowder Plot online. I'm not going to dwell further on it. But in the 1940s, the life tenant was Sir Robert Throckmorton, who was unenthusiastic about handing over the estate to the National Trust. But with, as I've said, his persuasiveness, it was James befriending Robert's formidable mother, Lady Throckmorton, that led to the transfer being driven through. On the 15th of September 1942, James visited Coughton to go through a list of family heirlooms with her. She was living in the South Wing, only in expectation of the arrival either of American officers or nuns. Obviously, the house was going to be requisitioned, which she would have preferred. He doesn't recall. Lady Throckmorton is delightful, plain, unfashionable, intelligent, and downright. She's worked in Coughton's interest for 30 years, upholding its Catholic traditions without becoming a Catholic herself. It's entirely owing to her that Coughton is to become trust property, despite the hostility of the Throckmorton family. Coughton is a thoroughly romantic house, but the late Georgian front is gloomy. Lady T is amusingly mischievous about people, the family associations, the papistry, recusancy, Gunpowder Plot, and intermarriages with other ancient Catholic families are thrilling. And on the 27th of May 1947, James visited Coughton. Again, Lady Throckmorton welcomed him, and he noticed the place was looking improved and no longer impoverished. And for some inexplicable reason, he decided to drive on to Dudley. Whether he was looking for the place where the gunpowder plotters were cornered and slaughtered, I don't know. But he went to Dudley, and then, having gone to Dudley, he went to the zoo. Have you been to Dudley Zoo? This is James's description: a ghastly place, sickened by humanity in the gross. The people of the Midlands are incredibly primitive. Charlecote, a magnificent Elizabethan house near Stratford-upon-Avon and on the banks of the Avon, an expansive deer park where it's said that Shakespeare shot deer. The house was donated to the trust in 1946 after the death of the eccentric Sir Henry Fairfax Lucy in 1944. James first visited in 1936, not long after he'd taken up his appointment. He was then rather new to the job and naive. Sir Henry, military, dapper and arrogant, walked in quickly round the park and garden. It was raining. On returning to the porch, Sir Henry stretched out his hand and bade James goodbye. James said, "Would you mind if I had a look inside?" "Absolutely no need," he said. "Charlecote is known to be one of the finest, if not the finest, houses in England. Good morning." Back at the office, James was castigated for his stupidity. He went back in July 1942, older and wiser, and formed a more kindly opinion of Sir Henry. Underneath the strutting, the peppery, the arrogant surface, a kindly old man lurks. In fact, I'm rather sorry for him because I think he's a little odd. He's obstinate and muddle-headed because of his oddness. I believe he struggles to be reasonable and just cannot manage to be. Well, this time he saw both house and garden, but the owner was so contradictory that by the end of the visit, neither of them really knew what had been agreed. He said, "I thought he was rather touching when he urged haste. How is this to be achieved with him?" James went back on the 31st of May 1945, after the death of Sir Henry, to inspect the contents with a furniture expert and Brian Fairfax Lucy, son of Sir Henry. James was not particularly impressed with the house, which he thought had been over-restored and had a lot of furniture claiming to be of the Shakespearean period, which had probably been made a few years before he visited. But of the grounds, the park with deer and sheep, the Avon below the library window, the flat meadows on the far bank, the long lime avenue make Charlecote a dream of slumbering beauty. And that, I think, description resonates today, does it not, if you visit Charlecote, as I know many of you will have done. 3 weeks later, James returned to lunch with the Fairfax Lucys and met Brian's wife, Alice, for the first time. Of her, he said, attractive, quizzical, and intelligent, not John Buchan's daughter for nothing, he of the 39 Steps. At this time, the house was about to open, and James came back to see the guides in operation after the house was opened. They impressed him with how they spoke, despite lapsing into occasional inanities. But, he mused, I wonder how much the substance of what they say matters. And I think anybody who's guided anybody around anywhere perhaps would empathize with that. It's not what you say, it's how you say it, isn't it? That really matters, and people remember. Courthouse in Chipping Campden. Inevitably, not all of James's endeavours led to success. On Tuesday, the 6th of June 1948, he went to the Marlborough Club in London to meet Anthony Noel, the 5th Lord Gainsborough, and also Viscount Camden. The Camden title goes back to 1627 and passed to the Noel family by marriage. And by repute, the manor house was built in Chipping Campden by Sir Baptist Hicks in around 1608, burnt down, as I'm sure many of you know, in the Civil War in 1645. The ruins stand today. The courthouse was probably built from the manor's old stables, and it was this that Lord Gainsborough wished to discuss with James. He says he may offer the whole property, including the courthouse, on condition that his family have a right of residence in perpetuity. And then this, again, lovely description of Lord Gainsborough. He's a tubby little boy. I should say he was then 25 and has succeeded to the title at the age of 4. Very young, a sort of schoolboy's annual hero with a distinct look of his handsome mother about the mouth. Very polite he is, earnest, Catholic, but physically a suet pudding. Indeed, he'd been declared unfit for military service in 1943, but his apparent poor health did not prevent him from fathering 8 children and living until 2009. So, some concluding matters. For much of World War II, James was living in a flat in Chelsea near the river. He described in vivid detail his own narrow escape from a doodlebug. And when I read this, I think of the poor people all over the world who are having to face drones coming at them all the time. He described in vivid detail his own narrow escape from a doodlebug, and he expressed his vehement opposition to aspects of the conduct of the war. On the 27th of July, 1944, this is a picture of what a doodlebug did at the beginning of July in Chelsea. He went to bed in his mansion block at 11 o'clock. At midnight, a bomb fell with a great noise and the cellar was filled with fumes. He walked out into the road and could see a cloud of explosive streaming from the river in front of him. He heard people in the street shout, "Look, another one's coming." I was left transfixed and knew there was no time to descend to my basement. I looked at the light of the flying bomb coming straight at me. Then the engine stopped and I knew we were for it. I lay flat on the pavement, as close as could be to the embankment wall. I heard the bomb swish through the air. It too fell in the river, only closer than the last, and sent a spray of water over me. At dawn, I met a policeman picking up a fragment of the bomb from the road. It was over a foot long and must have hurtled over my head. I could see that all of my windows were out again. On Monday, the 16th of June, 1947, James took a walk in Lower Brockhampton and reflected upon the state of the country. This evening, the whole tragedy of England impressed itself upon me. Referring to Brockhampton Hall, this small, not very important seat in the heart of our secluded country is now deprived of its last squire. A whole social system has broken down. What will replace it beyond government by the masses, uncultivated, rancorous, savage, Philistine, the enemies of all things beautiful? How I detest democracy. More and more, I believe in benevolent autocracy. Well, we've managed to struggle through for another 75 years, and some people are still expressing the same sort of sentiments, aren't they? And finally, a final waspish remark which perhaps sums up James, a man of contrasts. On Monday, the 7th of January 1946, he went to the National Gallery, which was so full the rooms stank, and he thought he would faint. I was actually, when I read this, quite impressed by the fact the National Gallery was full. He looked at the Paul Clees. There was an exhibition of them. They are pretty designs, said James, that would do well for bathroom curtains. Clees' 10 years with the Bauhaus at the forefront of modernism could not save him from James's withering condemnation. Thank you.
Well, I don't know what else you can tell us, but I expect somebody's probably got a question or two.
What would James think of the National Trust now and its management of its houses?
I suspect he wouldn't be altogether happy. I mean, it very much depends upon where you're looking at things from, I think. My view is that where would we be without the National Trust? All these houses would not have been acquired, and goodness only knows many of them would have been demolished or turned into blocks of flats or whatever. On the other hand, I think there's a school of thought, isn't there, which says that there's a danger that they all gradually become the same. Well, look the same shop, same food, all the rest of it. I think James, as I said, would look and say, are we looking at places where real people lived, and are we looking at the lives which they lived in them? And that would have been what he wanted to preserve. Whether you think that's what you see when you go to National Trust houses, I think you're as equipped as I am to say.
Thank you.
Pleasure.